Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to day 2 of the Global Forum on Forest Governance 2021. My name is Tim Benton. I am Research Director at Chatham House and head of the Energy, Environment and Resources Programme, our biggest research programme at Chatham House. So today is day 2. I've been asked to summarise before I start what happened yesterday in day 1, and I have got a few notes that I will just kind of summarize quickly. Key takeaways from session 1. There remains a commitment to and recognition of the importance of sustained international partnerships for the sustainable management of land and forests. The market is an important driver for reform. Consumer countries have a role to play in encouraging legal and sustainable trade, and also reducing their own consumption. Partnerships must consider the needs and priorities of local communities, and funding is also needed to help build institutional capacity in many countries. VPAs have brought about significant changes in tropical forest countries, with reductions in illegal logging and improvements in governance of the sector. Any move away from the VPAs risks undermining the improvements seen. There are many valuable lessons to be learned from VPAs for partnerships for other commodities, including the importance of multi-stakeholder processes, the role of technology in improving transparency, and the need for cross-government coordination. Future international partnerships need to ensure there is clarity and a shared understanding of objectives. Takeaways from session 2, the full engagement of grassroots organisation, including Indigenous and rural peoples, is essential to achieving sustainable forest and land use by 2030. Ensuring this requires establishing different ways of providing funding and of working with these Indigenous and grassroots organisations. Corruption remains a huge challenge. There is an urgent need to improve transparency and accountability to help overcome this. Right, so that was yesterday and now today. So today's session is about sustainable trade through import regulations. Now, as everybody is fully aware, there are active discussions in the EU, UK and US, but beyond the headlines that people are worrying about it, it is unclear how to balance the vested interests of producers and producer countries versus importing countries and their consumers, because the interests and the needs are very different at those two ends of the supply chains. So we might talk in an airy way about due diligence regulations, but actually how to do it on the ground is still very much a fast-moving debate. And of course, technical change and different organizations and institutions' desire to move the agenda forward means that there is a plethora of ideas and schemes that are kind of growing at different rates. And today's session is really about how to think this through and how these issues will play out. Now, before we go on to the session, which will be an introduction by Ruthnussbaum from ProForest and then a panel discussion, I've just got some housekeeping to do. So just a reminder, this session is being interpreted and is available in English, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Indonesian. And if you go to your Zoom window at the bottom right-hand side, you will find the translation button. This session is on the record. Video recordings will be shared when the forum is completed. And then the final item of housekeeping before we start is that we will have time for questions and answers. Please do put your questions as we go along in the Q&A box, and we will pick those up when we come to the open discussion. The Q&A box, as you can see, is also at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Don't necessarily wait for the end of the presentations and then put them in. Feel free to put them in as we go along. Okay, so I think that's the housekeeping over and done with. Now we can get on to the meat of today. I'm very pleased to welcome Ruthnussbaum, Group Director of ProForest, She has been working with responsible production and sourcing of natural resources for more than 20 years in more than 40 countries, so a huge wealth of experience. So Ruth, I will hand over to you for a framing presentation for this session. Over to you.
Great, thanks very much, Tim, and good morning, everyone. Just to check that you can see my presentation. Great. So it's really great to be here and to this kind of third session through this 2 days, talking about how we can really work on sustainable trade through due diligence. As Tim said, my name is Ruthnussbaum, and I'm a global director at ProForest, and great to be here with you. So just seeing if I can, yeah. So where I wanted to start is as we think about these regulations, which, as Tim said, we're developing now in 2021, just to stop for a second and think about where we're starting from. Now, deforestation is not new, and we've been working to end it for many years, for most of my career, and I'm well through my career now. And so when we look at where we are, I think when I first started, that there wasn't even a shared view on whether or not deforestation was a problem. I think now everybody agrees that stopping the loss of forests and other natural ecosystems is really crucial for climate, for people, for nature. That commodity production is one of the significant drivers, not the only one, and that's important. And that regulation is a very powerful tool and can help drive long-term change. So we've moved forward a great deal over the last 2 decades. And while we've been doing that, we've also learned a lot about what works and what doesn't. And as we develop these new regulations, it's really important that we build on this experience. So what I want to do today is we're kind of building off the experience that ProForest has had over the last two decades to talk about 3 things that I think are really important and which I hope we'll be able to explore more over the rest of this morning. So ProForest has supported companies to implement responsible sourcing commitments over the last 20 years. And also supported many multi-stakeholder initiatives, bringing companies together with governments, with civil society, with producers, with communities. And there are 3 things that, as I said, I think are really important. First of all, that supply chain action is essential, and companies that are buying and trading commodities should definitely be taking action within their own supply chains. But by itself, we've learned it's not sufficient to drive transformation. And so they also need to work beyond their own supply chains in landscapes and in sectors. And I'll talk about that a bit more. The second thing, and Tim already referred to it from the discussions yesterday, that equity and local ownership of actions is absolutely fundamental to systemic change. You can't force change from the outside, you can only support it from the inside. And we really need to make sure that we're aware of that. And thirdly, what that means in terms of the regulation, and again, I'll talk about this more, is that we definitely need assurance, but we also need something that provides space for collaboration and for mitigation, for dealing with those systemic issues. So if I look at the first one, action beyond supply chains, what we found over the last 20 years is that working on individual supply chains and the production areas that supply them can lead to real improvement. But often what we see is islands of good practice in a wider kind of sea of less good practice. We've seen this in many places, and often what it means is that forest loss is displaced from one area to another and that the net gain is limited. And to be clear, this approach is really important. It's often things like certification that have driven it, and it has been and will continue to be a crucial tool, because it helps to show us what's possible. It provides really credible assurance. But if our goal is sectoral transformation, if what we want to do is to end deforestation and conversion of natural ecosystems, we need to go beyond just working in narrow supply chains. And I think the importance of that is now increasingly recognized as we reach 2020, when many companies had targets to remove deforestation from their own supply chains. There was a lot of reviewing, first, why had that not been met in full? And secondly, why was deforestation continuing even where people had made a lot of progress? And this recognition that it's action within your supply chain continues to be important, but collaborative action beyond it in landscapes and sectors is essential. And we see it in things like the CDP reporting framework. And we also see it in many company platforms. For example, the Consumer Goods Forum, Forest Positive Coalition. And I think we will hear perhaps a little more about that from Stephen from Tesco, one of our panelists, who's very much involved and leading on some of that work. Local ownership and equity, I think for those of you who were part of the discussions yesterday, that's already been talked about a lot. But from the perspective of ending commodity-driven deforestation, trading in more sustainable commodities, local ownership and equity is really important for justice, but also from a very practical perspective. The landscapes where commodities are produced are complex and diverse, and there are many different underlying causes of deforestation, and different actions and different actors are needed to address those different drivers. So where you have deforestation which is driven by commercial production, companies can indeed use their commercial leverage and their supply chain relationships to try to change the dynamic and to reduce deforestation. But where there is illegal deforestation, for example, that's not something that companies should be addressing. That's a government enforcement role. Nor should companies be dictating how communities are choosing to use their land. That's something that local communities have to decide, for themselves. While often we see that deforestation is being driven by poverty or lack of anything else to do, and alternative livelihoods programs are really important. And ultimately, 20 years of work in this area has said that where national policies and programs aren't in place, it's rarely possible through commercial relationships to have a substantial impact on land use change and deforestation. Again, over the last 2 decades, lots of stuff has happened, and there's a huge amount to build on, not least, as we already heard, the EU FLEGT program, which has worked with timber and timber commodity production. We'll hear later from Roslyn from the Ghana Forestry Commission, and just one example of what they've done through their Ghana Red Plus program is to develop hotspot intervention areas where government can work together with companies, with local communities, with multilaterals, bringing people together to work in landscapes. And many of the companies that we work with, in addition to their own supply chains, are beginning to think about how to work in these wider landscapes. And though we don't have anyone on our panel today from Brazil, many of you will be familiar with the Mato Grosso Produce, Conserve, Include approach, which has also looked at how can you bring together people beyond supply chains to make systemic change happen. And lots of work going on to develop as we understand better how to do these things, to develop guidance and good practice guidelines. So loads to build on, and very important that we do. And so what all that means is that it's really important, and no, my third and perhaps most important learning that I want to talk about for this meeting is that we need both assurance and mitigation. And it's a practical issue, but it's also an ethical one. If we build requirements that just take the good production and leave the rest, we may be able to meet a narrow version of we only buy deforestation free, but we are unlikely to be contributing to real improvement. So we need to recognize that regulators and consumers need assurance that commodities are deforestation free. And we need to make sure that we are able to deliver that. But we also need to think about how do we do that in a way that we're not simply pushing the deforestation risk commodities to other markets with less demand. And what that means is that we need an approach which at least recognizes when people are supporting change in areas where production is not yet deforestation free, because that's where we need the work to happen. And companies are only going to engage and support work there if they feel that is at least recognized within legislation, and preferably to some extent rewarded, that they are working actually to improve things, as well as making sure that they are taking production where it is already deforestation free. And so that kind of supporting progress and not exclusion, particularly, it has many ethical issues, and we will hear shortly from Uki from Fortasby, who, as you can see in the screenshot here, are working in Indonesia to support small producers to improve. And if we have a very narrow definition of what's risk and what's due diligence, then we risk having unintended consequences around poverty and equity. At the same time, we also need to make sure that engagement activities are real. All of us are very familiar with endless kind of programs which do little but have lots of very good publicity and claim to be solving problems without doing it. And so making sure that we are really clear about what mitigation means, what engagement to promote progress means, and that what people are claiming is really credible is also crucial. And great to have David from ICIL here, who hopefully will talk to us more about that. So in conclusion, what does a smart mix that so many people have been talking about, what does that really mean? So as we kind of think about the regulation, we have a really great opportunity to use the power of regulation, and definitely regulation has power, particularly in driving the private sector. They can't ignore regulation, so it really matters. But at the same time, we need to learn from what has worked and what hasn't worked over the last couple of decades. And if we can do that, then maybe we can really begin to make a new level of progress in transforming commodity production so that it's no longer associated with the loss of natural ecosystems. But to do that, we have to think about how to promote and ensure there's action beyond individual supply chains, how to make sure everything is built on equity and local ownership of actions. And what that means in practice is that we need to find ways to have regulation which provides assurance, which we all need, but also that provides support for mitigation and engagement in the places where we need to help progress to happen. So I hope over the next couple of hours, we'll be able to talk about that more, and really look forward to hearing from all of the panel. And Tim, back over to you.
Thank you very much, Ruth. Brilliant setting up for the rest of the speakers. So the way this panel is going to work is we've got now 4 back-to-back presentations that Ruth has highlighted so far. I will introduce the speakers as a block just now. They will give their presentations, and then we will move into a question and answer session. So our 4 speakers in order are David Dollander, who's Manager, Policy and Innovations at ICIL. He's an expert on the interaction between public policies and private sustainability standards and certification systems. He's going to be followed by Rosalind Fosua-Adjei, Director for the Climate Change and National REDD+ Focal Point in the Forestry Commission of Ghana. Her mandate is to contribute to the achievement of the Commission's vision to sustainably manage and develop Ghana's forests and wildlife resources by designing local climate mitigation and adaptation plans, policies and actions that contribute to Paris, the Paris Agreement. Then we have Stephen Ripley, who is Group Responsible Sourcing Manager Forests for Tesco. Stephen works as the Responsible Sourcing Forest Lead at Tesco's with a particular focus on soy, palm and wood, and previously held positions at UNESCO, IDH, Global Canopy, and 2 supply chain traceability software companies over 20 years. And then our final speaker is Ruqayyah Rafiq, Principal of the School of Sustainable Palm Oil Farmers in Indonesia. This forum was initiated by several NGOs and organization of oil palm smallholders, It is a forum to increase the capacity of oil palm independent smallholders towards sustainable certification. So an absolutely fantastic panel. Really looking forward to your 10-minute presentations. So let's start at the top. David, over to you.
Great, thank you, Tim. Let me just pull up my presentation here. And can you all see and hear me fine?
Yep.
Great. So hi, everybody. I'm David Dellender with ICEAL. So I'm going to talk in a bit more detail about the emergence of due diligence regulations and how these really represent a new type of demand-side regulation that can be quite a game changer. And so I want to do kind of go over three things in my presentation. First of all, I broadly want to sketch out what these due diligence regulations are starting to look like and what we already know about them. And I will really go over this quite briefly. Then I want to link this up to the role of voluntary standard and certification systems, because they have been one of the primary tools in which companies have been able to address deforestation and other sustainability issues in their supply chains. And then I want to also provide some reflections and considerations for these policymaking processes. So first of all, a few words about ICEAL. So we are a convening organization for market-based sustainability initiatives. We work together with some of the most widely used voluntary standard and certification systems, such as RSPO, FSC, etc. But we also look at a whole range of innovative and credible sustainability tools that can be used by companies and others. So for example, what Ruth already alluded to in her presentation, we also work, for example, in the space of landscape and jurisdictional approaches. One key thing to note here that I'm not speaking on behalf of our members here today. We are really speaking here in our capacity as an independent expert. So to the topic of my presentation, I think the first thing to note is that the space of corporate due diligence is really a very lively and ongoing debate, and it is actually quite broad, especially because due diligence also can mean due diligence on human rights, due diligence on other non-environmental issues. And so, for example, within a lot of EU countries and at the EU level, there's a big discussion ongoing around what horizontal or human rights due diligence will look like. Now, for the sake of this presentation, I will try to focus mainly on those legal legislative initiatives that focus on due diligence regulations that tackle deforestation, of course. And so I think it's perhaps useful to note that there's already a first generation, if you will, of regulations in place that have looked to make sure that companies do due diligence on timber products and make sure that they do not come from illegally harvested wood. And so in the EU, you have the EU timber regulation. Of course, in the US, you have the US Lacey Act. Australia and other countries have similar laws. And what we're seeing with this second generation of new due diligence laws is that they're both broadening the scope of the commodities that would fall under these laws, as well as how you define deforestation. And so the UK environmental bill that was adopted last year, if I'm not mistaken, that looks at illegal deforestation, but across a range of commodities. So not just timber, but also potentially palm oil, soy, beef, etc. And then what is being discussed at the EU level not only looks at a range of, or will look at a range of commodities, but it will also look not just at illegal deforestation, but also at legally allowed deforestation and ecosystem degradation. So that is quite an important distinction, of course, because that will cover quite a broad range of commodities and supply chains. So what do these laws mean for companies? Well, again, simplifying here, but they mean that companies will have a legal responsibility to do a number of steps. The first one being that they will need to assess and map their supply chains, so know their suppliers, not just their first tier, but really all the way up to production base. Then they will have to identify risk related to deforestation in their supply chains. They will have to address and mitigate those risks and then report on that process. Now, I think the first thing to say is that both ICEAL and our members are quite supportive of these legislative initiatives, because what we, of course, have seen in the voluntary space is that there's always companies that have not been interested in dealing with deforestation or sustainability issues in their supply chains. And in the voluntary space, of course, those can just walk away, so to speak. And if you can establish a broad legal basis for each company to take this serious and to act on this, that can be indeed a very important game changer. Now, the second thing to note here is that these 4 steps that I laid out, while they might seem quite straightforward, are actually very complex. And so for companies to implement them in different contexts for different commodities, they are very complex. And for governments to then monitor and try to enforce all of that, that will also be quite a complex question. And so there's a range of issues here that will need to be unpacked for these regulations or for these due diligence laws to be effective and impactful. One thing, for example, is how will we make sure that companies are identifying risks in a credible and consistent manner? You know, that not one company is just doing this in a way that's kind of suits itself better, and then another company is doing it in another way. Secondly, also something that Ruth already alluded on, what do effective mitigation strategies look like? You can imagine that this is a very broad container, and we actually want to get a bit more specific within these laws about what good mitigation actually means. And so we really think that all of these will need to be impacted, and otherwise these new due diligence regulations might not really have the impact that we want them to have. Now, luckily, there's a range of voluntary tools, standard systems and certification systems that have already built up a whole base of knowledge, of criteria, of practices that policymakers can leverage to really give direction to what due diligence by companies should look like. And so we think it's really important that regulators and policymakers think about how they can leverage and build on all of these credible tools to build out what due diligence actually looks like. And so these are some of the key questions that we at ICL, together with a range of stakeholders, are unpacking and that we're working on. So the first one I already explained is, trying to kind of unpack how due diligence regulation and voluntary standards can interact and can build on each other and then strengthen each other. And this is really related to another question that also has already kind of come up in Ruth's presentation, where, we want to make sure that due diligence doesn't just stop at identifying and avoiding risks. And actually, identifying risks have become relatively easy through the use of satellite imaging and remote sensing. So you can actually spot deforestation better than ever before, but that doesn't mean it has become easier to actually go down to the root causes and go engage suppliers and producers to change their practices. And so this is really something that is, of course, key if you actually want to have an impactful implementation of your regulation. And a third question related to that is, how can we ensure that these due diligence laws still ensure that collaboration and collective action within sectors remains key? And so here the question is that if we establish individual legal responsibility of companies, what will the effect be on their ability to collaborate, share information, share data, come together and make joint investments where they are needed? So this is something else that we really need to consider. And so from these questions, we have started writing out, a couple of broad lines that we think are important in this policy debate. So first of all, for an effective due diligence framework to be put in place, we do think, of course, it needs to establish a realistic legal floor that better defines responsibilities. It should align with definitions and criteria from the initiatives that have been developing for a very long time and that have brought multi-stakeholder buy-in. And then we want companies to really focus their investments into effective mitigation strategies. And that will mean, again, engaging with suppliers in a substantive manner, but also providing consistent incentives to high-risk producers and not just trying to exclude them from supply chains. Now, I think it's also important to focus on if due diligence regulations can regulate individual supply chains, this actually needs to happen within, with an eye on the broader dynamics within a sector and just within the whole dynamic of corporate sourcing. And one thing that we want to highlight here is that what we don't think is useful is if these due diligence laws would lead to further duplication and fragmentation in how European or UK companies engage with their upstream actors and producers. So what we don't necessarily think is that useful is if each company would be kind of legally obliged to do a whole stakeholder process or run its own grievance mechanism, if we know that actually those things can be run much better at a collective level. Secondly, again, we need support for pre-competitive collaboration. The value of sector-wide roundtables is quite clear there. And then thirdly, we also want to stress that certification and standard systems can't solve certain issues. And what we really also need to think about is how companies can address conditions in their supply chains, but beyond their narrow supply chain, so to speak. So within the landscapes and jurisdictions where their products are being sourced from, this of course goes back to Ruth's point as well around the idea that we need effective landscape and jurisdictional approaches to drive forward these kind of more structural long-term processes. So just to conclude, I think the obvious thing to state here is that trying to regulate supply chain driven deforestation through due diligence regulations is quite a complex question. And really everybody who's looking at this agrees that we need a smart mix of policy measures, not just only is kind of standalone due diligence law. And the idea that we can have use due diligence law as kind of a big stick to kind of force companies to do the right thing without thinking about, the carrots and the other types of incentives and disincentives that you need for different supply chain actors. That is quite risky, so to speak, to put all your eggs in the baskets of due diligence law to solve all these issues. Secondly, again, multi-stakeholder standards are effective tools both within due diligence process and beyond that. We certainly don't think that the adoption of a due diligence law will somehow replace or make these credible standard systems obsolete. To the opposite, we think, again, policymakers should really leverage these and build on these. And then lastly, we think it's important that companies think of developing a smart toolbox of different types of approaches to tackle something as complex as deforestation. And again, a due diligence law or a regulatory framework needs to give companies the ability to do that and not just focus on narrow compliance or just the paperwork. Because again, that will not lead to the type of impacts that we all want to see, of course. So I'll stop here.
Thank you, David.
Just in time, I see, and I'll pass it back to you, Tim.
Thanks very much. Good timekeeping. So without further ado, and just a reminder to add questions as we go along, we'll move straight over to Roslyn from Ghana. Over to you, Roslyn.
Thank you very much, Tim, and thank you to Ruth and David. Your presentations have really done a lot of the talking for me, and greetings to everybody on this particular dialogue, interesting discussions. I'm coming to you from Accra, Ghana, and today I'm going to share some experiences on how government collaboration with companies is really helping us to address issues of due diligence and then also sustainable trade. So I go back to a point that Ruth made, that regulators and consumers want assurance that their commodities are coming from deforestation-free landscapes. I think that companies form the bridge in between these regulators and consumers. And companies are right in the midpoint to deliver goods to consumers that consumers also want to certify within themselves that they are not consuming anything that is causing any deforestation or degradation to the environment. Now, that is where, again, companies play a very important role, because if you look at where all these due diligence regulations are coming from, they are coming from countries where these companies mostly are coming from. In Ghana, we have a lot of our companies in our cocoa landscapes coming from outside the country. And again, most of the cocoa that we are even producing is being exported outside the country. And as a country producing the raw material, we also have a tax to ensure that our raw material is also being sourced within a deforestation-free regulation landscape. So really, we all have priorities and objectives that are speaking to each other, but are from different sides. And that's how come we believe that when companies and governments come together, we can deliver goods that are very wholesome and sustainable, and further reduce any chances of deforestation or forest degradation. And David made a very important point that for companies on those 4 steps, assessing the risk, devising the mitigation strategies, I mean, doing it alone can be a challenge. And that is where government comes in to partner with companies. Of course, government also just monitoring alone also is a challenge. But then we realize that companies are in these landscapes where these raw materials are. One, they are in touch with the locals who want ownership of whatever program or initiative that is coming up, because if we do not have them owning, as Ruth said, systemic change is going to be difficult. And government also provides the enabling framework, environment, policy, measures to guide actions surrounding these supply chain initiatives. And so when we come together with the knowledge base of companies and with the enabling environment that governments are providing, then we don't have to work out these challenges alone. We can work out these challenges together in a concerted manner, in a collaborative manner. And when we do that, we release the burden of each other because, one, we are trying to understand each other's language, we are trying to understand each other's priorities, and together we are coming up with interventions that help us to achieve a win-win situation. And it's a win-win-win, one for the landscape, one for the company, one for the government. And eventually it comes together to address global challenges such as climate change that we are faced with. And so I give you, for example, what we are doing in Ghana, and Ruth mentioned this in part, in our Red Plus programs and how we are also linking this globally to our Cocoa and Forest Initiative, which is basically a pledge between governments and companies that we are going to source cocoa beans from sustainably managed landscapes where deforestation and forest degradation is being brought to the barest minimum. How do we do this? We are doing this through enabling structures such as governance arrangements. These are quite phenomenal. We haven't had them formalized in the past. Now, these governance arrangements provide the very framework for us to engage, to have inclusivity, to have transparency, to have accountability. Together, we understand the actions that are going to work, the actions that we can test, how we can test them, in which particular space, who are we bringing on board? And so we enhance the concerted effort of every stakeholder that is relevant in that particular discussion. Now, once we do that, we also put in place a mechanism for monitoring and evaluation and learning so that we can, on a periodic basis, monitor, are we speaking to the objectives of companies? Are we speaking to the objectives of governments? Are we helping the local people in the landscapes who depend on these forest resources for their livelihoods? And as we do that, we evaluate the process, we evaluate our progress, and then we're able to learn and apply different best practices in other landscapes. So this is how we have been working in Ghana, and we realize that it is really working out very well. We have started, we started this around 2017 on a very large scale in some of these hotspot intervention areas that Ruth mentioned. But before this 2017, we had gone through a 10-year period of readiness, of sensitizing the communities, sensitizing stakeholders, putting up structures. David mentioned grievance redress. You do not have, as a country, as a company, to develop your own grievance redress mechanism. We need a grievance redress mechanism that speaks to the landscape because the issues in the landscape are common. It's a high forest zone, it's a cocoa growing area. Is it possible that together with government, we develop this grievance redress mechanism that speaks to different issues? We come up with safeguards interventions that ensure social and environmental integrity. So from that period of readiness, the 10 years, all these structures have been put in place. And then now we are in the phase of implementation where we are deploying them. And we have wonderful stakeholders and partners like ProForest who are helping us. For example, we have come up with a document which we're going to launch very soon called Engagement Principles for the Ghana's Cocoa Forest Red Plus program. It's phenomenal. It shows you as a company, if you want to be sustainable, how do you get onto this landscape action and move away from your silo action in your supply chain to contribute to a bigger picture. Now, this document spells out the steps. It has a phenomenal 10-step agenda for you to realize as a company what your priorities are and how your priorities fit into that landscape and how your priorities also respond to the priorities of other stakeholders, including government and local communities. And as we do this, then we collectively respond to the different due diligence regulations. And I also believe that the added benefit of even engaging directly with companies is that we are able to feed back into the due diligence regulations that are coming from the countries, because companies are both in our landscapes that is the local environment. And they also have their source from the external countries that have these due diligence regulations. And so they are able to tell a better story of what would work and what would not work and how feasible it is, the time span that we should allow ourselves to implement these due diligence regulations. Because first of all, Ruth made a statement which is very important. Deforestation has been with us for a very long time. We cannot expect any policy to come in just today and begin to work just today. It will
Well,
take
oh, you're back.
So some of the perspectives from that I'm going to bring here. Yeah, sorry if I broke off, but I was just wrapping up that these are some of the perspectives that I'm bringing from Ghana. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rosalind. I think we just lost you for 15 seconds at the end, but a very powerful presentation. Okay, now I can see questions are starting to come in. Please continue putting your questions in the Q&A box and we will come to those in due course. Now I'm going to hand straight over to Stephen Ripley from Tesco. Over to you, Stephen. You're on mute.
Thank you very much, Tim. So I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yep.
Okay, great. I'll just put it in.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, so thanks very much for the invitation to Chatham House and to ProForest for Tesco to present some of its work on its supply chains and in a broader component of how we collaborate with others to increase our impact. So the first element of how Tesco works to improve sustainability is really about working directly with our suppliers. And not only our suppliers, not only our direct or tier one suppliers, but their suppliers. And the aim here is to really improve the performance of our supply chain. So we do this in a number of ways. We develop and implement policy for the major environmental footprints in our business and supply chain. Now, for Tesco, as many people on this call may be aware, the biggest footprint is soy. It's a significant portion of the UK's annual usage of soy. So that is very much our focus, and that's a core role in my job. We also work closely with our suppliers to decrease the environmental impact of the supply chain. So it's not only about making demands on our suppliers, but really understanding their perspective and how we can make it work for them. Excuse me. Further than that, we reach up the supply chain to engage with the traders and processors directly about our shared concerns, because often it's not the tier one suppliers who can really make the change. They're obviously dependent on actors who are further up the supply chain. As well as working with our suppliers, we work very closely with many of our peers, many advisors, many NGOs, members of civil society, consultants, etc., etc. And we're members of a number of leading groups which are trying to collectively form this collaborative action and coordination in the supply chain to bring about a more forest positive future. Ruth already mentioned we work a lot in the Consumer Goods Forum Forest Positive Coalition, where we're members of the soy working group, the palm working group, and the landscapes working group. And I'll come on to a bit more detail about those later on. We're also members of several other pre-competitive multi-stakeholder groups, such as the Retail Soy Group, the Soy Transparency Coalition, the SOS for the Cerrado Group, and various other roundtables and certification schemes, etc. But I think the important point about all of these is that they have a shared aim to coordinate and magnify the call for deforestation-free supply chains. So how do these groups do that, and how does Tesco do that? Well, again, there are a number of approaches, but I think more and more these approaches seem to be kind of aggregating on one or two key methods. And I think these are in terms of having consistent supplier requirements throughout the entire supply chain, so that as the Forest Positive Coalition is leading on, it's a consistent ask throughout the supply chain, and effectively this results in a consistent policies throughout the supply chain, so that the entire supply chain can move together and it makes business sense for all those individual actors to transition to a more sustainable footing. Other interesting approaches that are currently either in practice or taking shape are the French manifesto, the French soy manifesto, which you may have heard of, which is mandating that all soy that's coming into France is actually deforestation free and verifiable as such. We're working quite closely with the organizations who helped to develop the French manifesto, working on something similar for the UK. So it would be a UK version of the manifesto for sustainable soy, and we're developing the content of that with WWF and Africa, and also taking consultations with several of our peers in the retail sector and other important companies in the UK. In terms of roadmaps, I think I'm going to come on to that on my next slide. Just conscious of the time. So I guess the question then is that how does this all work in practice? So in terms of, to give you a few examples of how it works in practice, in terms of our responsible sourcing requirements, Tesco has a very ambitious target that by 2025 it will source 100% of its soy or soy meal from verified deforestation conversion free sourcing areas. Now, that's that's quite an easy thing to say. It's quite a lot more difficult to do in practice. It's a very ambitious target, and obviously Tesco, even as big as we are, cannot do it alone. So it's very much about working with partners, working with our supply chain, working beyond our supply chain in the landscape to try and develop solutions that can lead us to a more sustainable soy supply chain and a deforestation-free supply chain. In terms of the Forest Positive Coalition, they have indeed developed sector roadmaps, as I was just mentioning on my previous slide. And they're now engaging, and we as part of the Forest Positive Coalition are engaging with our supply chain on public commitments. We want them to cascade these public commitments throughout the supply chain. And we're all also holding ourselves to account to the same standards. So we're also committing to reporting on the same requirements that we're asking of our suppliers. And I think this is a critical point, that this is a shared responsibility. There's no way that any company of whatever size can do it alone. It's really about making a solution work for the entire supply chain, including the producers who are right at the beginning of the supply chain. Of course, that's a critical component. I've got a couple of minutes left according to my watch. So I'll give you a few more examples of how the approaches work. Another example is from the UK roundtables on soy and palm oil. Here, the UK roundtable on soy is leading on developing a sector roadmap for the specific for the pork sector. It's very much a consensual process. They're working with a group of leading companies to develop this roadmap that works for all stakeholders to transition to a sustainable soy supply chain. And of course, this is also reducing the risk of market leakage because you're involving the biggest companies in the sector in a coordinated approach. And the final example I'll give you is the SOS Cerrado group. So this was a group which was formed after the Cerrado Manifesto, which called for an end to deforestation in the Cerrado. And the SOS group was made up of many financial institutions and commercial organizations, companies, FMCG companies, and they all came together to say, we endorse this statement, we support it, and we're going to work towards deforestation-free Cerrado. So a couple of years ago, all the focus was on creating a new financial mechanism for farmers, working closely with the traders. Unfortunately, for one reason or another, that didn't quite happen as was planned. But the SOS group has continued, and we're now looking at new financial mechanisms, and a couple in particular which can compensate farmers on the ground, farmers who contractually agree to stop deforesting and agree to be monitored. But of course, they require some compensation for that, either cheaper business finance or payments for ecosystem services. So that's something we're very much focused on in that group at the moment. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Brilliant timekeeping and a wealth of examples then there. Okay, so our final speaker in this panel session is Ruqayyah Rafiq. And if you could stop sharing, Stephen, thank you. So Ruqayyah, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Tim. I will share my screen first. Okay, thank you. Okay. Thank you, everyone, and good morning from in Europe time, and good afternoon from Indonesia. And thank you also for Proporis and Chatham House to involve me in this interesting session, because in this session I want to share about what we already done in the ground, and how also we want to see about how the smallholder working to tackle deforestation. So my name is Ruqayyah Rafiq. I'm from Fortasby. And firstly, I want to introduce what the Fortasby is. You can see here that Fortasby is, Fortasby is Indonesian Sustainable Palm Oil Forum. This is founded in 2014 by Smallholders Group and also several NGO in Indonesia. And actually, we have mission to increasing the capacity of the smallholders, supporting them in maintaining the certification, and also we try to connect them to the market and also buyer. And then this is also the big work with us, is how we can bring the story from the ground, and also we are trying to scale up the impact of the certification. Until June, we already have 10,000 of the smallholders with the total area of 21,000 hectares. And mostly of them is certified of RSPO, and some of them might be 1,900 smallholders is certified ISPO. ISPO is Indonesian Sustainable Palm Oil. This is the national certification. And then we also have 200 smallholders certified of ISCC, but this is combined with the RSPO. And actually, all of the certification process is doing by our partner in the ground. We have more NGO here, and also we are collaborate with the company to support the independent smallholder to comply with the sustainability standard. And actually, Fortasby is only working with the independent smallholders because as we know that in Indonesia, we have two categories of the smallholder. We have the scheme and also the independent smallholder scheme is they already have good support from MIL, but independent, this is very independent. They not get any support from other, and then they also not get any support from the government. And why independent is very important, because they are contribute for 42% of the total production in Indonesia. If if we calculate that if each family have 4 until 5 members in their family, so this palm oils will impact to the 13 million people, and then they also have they also have the workers. And as we identified that mostly of independent smallholder, they are not they didn't know about how to plant palm oil, but so why we also identified that they are come from rubber farmer, cocoa, and also coconut. Actually, they are the new comer in the palm oil. So why we also find that there is a main problem in them, because like, for example, like organization, lack of the knowledge, low productivity, and etc. So this is the slide we want to describe how the progress of independent smallholder to tackle deforestation. We can see the number of the independent smallholder who joined to the certification for RSPO and ISPO. This is not really big number, but I think this is already changed in the ground. We already have the 19,000 hectares already certified. So why certification is very important for independent smallholder, and then why also Fortasby is very hard to transform about the sustainability standard, because we are so through the certification is like a process of learning. Or might be school for the smallholders. Why? Because through the certification they can learn about how to protect the NKT or HACCP. As in my member, we already identified that there is a 50 kilometers small river they are conserved. They are committed to conserve and protect the small river. And we also identified that in our member there is no fire in their port. So that this is the indicator that the sustainability already impacted to them. And then through the certification, they also learn about how to collaborate and partnership with the mill. So the certification is the tool how they can open the red door to go in, and then they learn many things in the certification. So, and sorry. Okay, so we are talking about the DD requirement and impact for the smallholders, especially in the independent smallholders. In independent smallholders is very weak as smallholder in the palm oil supply chain, because as I talked before, that they didn't have the organization, a long supply chain to the mill. So and then they also didn't have the capacity to meet the standard without support from stakeholders. And then there is still millions smallholder outside and didn't have a knowledge, and then also they didn't know how to start to maintain to develop the organization. They didn't know how to start to connect to the mill. And also in our experience, that mill only focus on their supply in internal supply base, for example, scheme. So why we see that still more smallholder outside in the system. So so now what they need actually for now. So we need you guys to support our government to continue the moratorium policy, because the moratorium, this is also the time to take a break for the smallholders, and then they have to focus on supporting smallholder empowerment. And also collaboration is must to accelerate NDPE and sustainable palm oil standard implementation among independent smallholders, because collaboration, this is also the tool how we can accelerate the sustainability implementation. And all stakeholders, buyer, mill, importer, country, government must share responsibility through support program to for smallholder. Like you have to provide the program to bring the smallholder to go to the whatever NDPE or maybe sustainability or certification, whatever you want to support the independent smallholders. And also all stakeholders must share responsibility to provide incentive for smallholders, because this is also the big things how we can like bring them to go to the system, and then also provide the incentive for the smallholder and also for the small farmer. because as I know that there is also the indigenous people, they are protecting the HCV and HTS. So you have to also provide the incentive for them so they can continue to protecting the forest. And also the DD and sustainable trade requirement have to include that mill or the company must have responsibility to support the smallholders in the supply base. So this is also our request. And then why we are talking about the incentive. This is the experience in the incentive from the RSPO certification. You can see that this is how the incentive work in the village level, not only impacted to increasing the productivity of the smallholder, but also this is impacted to the bigger or wider landscape for the social, for the environment, for the woman, for education, for children, and for everything. So incentive, this is very workful in the smallholders. Thank you, and back to Tim.
Thank you very much, everybody. That was a brilliant set of interventions. It says on my agenda that I'm supposed to summarize where we are now. So I've been taking some notes, and I'll just replay some of the major things that I've taken from this session before moving into the question and answer. So starting off with Ruth's presentation, I think 3 key messages for me. Need to go beyond working in supply chains to the landscape level, which requires collaborative action across sectors and not just narrow sense, building your own supply chains. Local ownership and equity requires involvement of different actors and actions, not just a pure focus on the supply chain itself. Again, legal actions, community-based processes, just transitions, etc. And assurance required, but also needs to grow mitigation, and that mitigation has to have a credible way of measuring that so that we scale up from those islands to making large-scale interventions. Then moving on, we had David, who asked kind of 3 key questions about due diligence. How can due diligence build on voluntary standards and them leverage against each other? How can due diligence stop at identifying and avoiding risks and actually get to the root causes? And how can due diligence ensure collaborative and collective action, collaboration and collective action? Then we moved on to Roslyn, who spoke from the position in Ghana. And really the major point is that companies and governments working together in partnership can deliver. Governments providing an enabling framework and companies working with both the resources and the communities to give a win-win-win for companies, landscapes and government, and gave an example of new governance frameworks, including an MEL framework, but made also the important point, it takes time. And the question that I would play back, working very much on climate risks, is do we have time before the sorts of heat experiences that we're finding in the Northern Hemisphere at the moment really start impeding on our ability for economic growth? Then we had Stephen giving some examples from Tesco's perspectives about taking responsibility for its own supply chain, but also working collaboratively in a pre-competitive way in multiple ways in multiple fora. And then we've had Rakaya finishing off the session, the panel presentations, highlighting the independent smallholders being a significant sector, but low capacity for adopting standards for palm oil in Indonesia. And that certification is both a tool and a process of capacity building and learning for people. And to enable that, all stakeholders must share responsibility for providing incentives, because there's no point in milling industry taking stuff that isn't certified, because of course that won't necessarily then provide the benefits, the incentives for people to adopt. So that's my brief overview of where we are. And now we're going to go until about, where are we? 10:50. So we've got 40 odd minutes for a question and answer session. And I can see questions and answers are coming in. And to avoid you just listening to me reading out the questions, some of which are quite long, I would like, if we can, behind the scenes team, to open the microphone for the speakers if they're available to ask their own questions. The top rated question at the moment comes from Michael Rice. Can we ask Michael to deliver his question live? Is that possible? Hello.
Hi. Hello. I hope you can hear me.
Oh yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Michael.
Wow, the wonders of technology. Thank you. I'll just read out what I posted in the Q&A. Given the overall poor performance of voluntary market mechanisms over the past 20 years, isn't it time to stop focusing on companies and start supporting and empowering local peoples and communities as the most important change makers in commodity production landscapes? Legal reforms are essential to address structural drivers of deforestation, but local communities in forest landscapes are often marginalized from political processes and ignored by corporate actors. How can demand-side legal reforms help resolve this? Thanks very much.
Thank you, Michael. Lovely to hear a different voice. Okay, who wants to tackle that from the panel? Who wants to go first? Because it is quite a challenging question.
So Tim, I'll take a first shot.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, so Michael rightly said, we can't just focus on companies, but we would be doing ourselves a disincentive if we also say, let's shift the focus of companies. And really that's where we have come from when we were focusing on just some individual entities at a time. Now we all have to come together to work. That's why what we are doing in Ghana,
What we're doing in Ghana is not having a strong internet. We've lost you, Rosalind.
Can you hear me now? Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll take that again. So I was saying that what Michael is saying is really true. And I think Ruth also said this, that we need local ownership to really get the systemic change that we need. But it would be a disincentive to shift focus from one particular stakeholder because we all have to come together to work. So the focus shouldn't just be on companies, but it should be on everybody in that landscape that can make a meaningful impact. And if we all come together, then we can achieve the success that we want. That is where we are, what we are doing in Ghana with these governance structures. And the central element or central people in these governance structures is the farmer, is the traditional authority, is the landowner. And then we leverage on the support of government to provide the enabling environment to put in place these institutional arrangements and also the companies to bring on board their technical and financial resources. Because of course, companies want to remain in business. And so they need their commodity supply chains to be sustainable. Government also needs to build its economy, and the people also depend on these resources for their livelihoods. So really, it's not about sidelining any particular stakeholder, but it's about how we harness the power and the potential of all stakeholders and not just focus on one or sideline any, but then work together in a concerted effort. And that's where really the collaborative action starts from and how we can achieve the impact that we want to achieve at scale. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosalind. Any other members of the panel want to address that question? Rukaya. No? Yes. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to add maybe a little. Yeah, as Rosalind said, that the collaboration is must. We cannot work alone. So I think everyone have to collaborate and also have to set responsibility. For example, for the company, they have to also support not only for the smallholder but also small farmer, indigenous people around them, because you know they also have access to that location. So I think involve the company and also for the government and maybe also for a local government in the village level have to involve and they have to share the responsibility to support to stop the deforestation. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you.
Maybe Tim, I can
yes, David.
jump in here as well. I mean, So first of all, I mean, I do want to perhaps bring a bit of nuance and the core assumption of this question that, you know, voluntary market mechanisms have poor performance over the past 20 years. I mean, I think it's important to note that some of these haven't barely been around for 20 years. And of course, they are quite a new form of governance. Trying to manage global supply chains is something that is actually quite a novel concept. And so, you know, saying that they have failed in the last 20 years, I think you could quite easily turn that around and think about, out of nothing, we have created systems of governance that actually have had a range of positive outcomes. And we are also the first to say that, you know, certification certainly hasn't solved all the problems. And I think you're absolutely right that a lot of these structural issues in producer countries are still there, and we need other ways to tackle those. Now, I think to the point of your question, do local legal reforms, you know, how can we support and empower those and the stakeholders around that? I mean, I think for me, and I don't know if anybody else from the panel knows, has any views on this, but for me, I think there's also a tension within local communities around conservation and economic development. And so just strengthening legal frameworks doesn't necessarily lift that tension. And so I think it's not necessarily a question of just you know, of just strengthening legal frameworks in its own right. I think there's market fundamentals behind that need to be solved, and policymakers and politicians in producer countries are also looking at those market dynamics. And so changing market dynamics by influencing what companies do can lead, I think, also in the long term to a range of structural reforms. And I guess the other thing I would say then is, of course, the work or the kind of the type of work we're doing and looking at landscape and jurisdictional approaches that does look at how companies can actually support better local policy frameworks and legal frameworks, and how we can get behind those. And so that is, you know, beyond just supply chain action or certification, for example. So I don't know if that already starts addressing your question. It's of course a very big question.
Thank you, David. Okay, if no one else wants to respond to that, let's move on to the next question. It's a question from James Hewitt, and it bears many similarities to a question from Tim Steinweg. So if the panel could just look at those two questions. But James, I'll give you the floor to ask your question through the microphone if you're available. James.
Yes, I am. Thank you very much, Tim. If climate and biodiversity are collapsing faster than progress, what role could price have in pulling through fundamental changes in diet, aspiration, and production? Or is this anathema to the current economic system, which so very obviously is so very obviously the elephant in the room? Thanks.
Thanks, James. And before you get onto that, I'll just précis Tim's question, because as I say, it's related. And that's around the demands. You know, a lot of what we're talking about is we're enabling better production of goods that might come with ultimately a very high environmental footprint. Should we be trying to change the demand function to avoid this collapsing faster than progress from James's question, and actually move away from some of these commodities that come with such a high price? So who would like to tackle these fundamental issues to do with the demand side? And provocatively, is sustainable palm oil actually possible, given that it is a commodity that actually underpins a lot of global ill health, even though people make profit from it in the short run? So, Stephen, you've taken yourself off microphones, off mute, so over to you.
I'll bravely try and answer some of these questions. So, yeah, of course, it is very challenging. There's no silver bullet. Silver bullets don't exist in my experience. So, you know, we're trying to trying to work within our sector with others in other sectors to advance the agenda as fast as possible. I think that's really all we can do. You know, any corporate actor or even a government actor cannot get too far ahead of the rest of the country or rest of the you know, the general population in which it operates. So at Tesco, for example, we're trying to dramatically increase the amount of meat replacement sold in our stores. Our target is 300% by 2025. We're trying to reduce the environmental impact of the average UK shopping basket, not just Tesco shopping baskets, but all shopping baskets, by half. And that's a project we have with WWF. Also, as I was saying on soy, we're not only trying to encourage and support and even enforce sustainable soy supply chains throughout our own supply chain for all our tier 1, 2, 3, 4 suppliers, right back to the feed manufacturers and the traders. And at the same time, as I mentioned in my presentation, we're working on developing financial mechanisms which will compensate the producers, the farmers who agree not to deforest. So I think we're doing quite a lot in terms of you know, working with the current system as it is. We have to accept that for better or worse, whilst trying to kind of pull it in the right direction, pull and push in the right direction, I guess.
Thank you, Stephen. Anybody else want to? Ruth.
Maybe just to add something to that and build on what Stephen was saying, that I think it links back to what several people have been saying, and Rosalind said in answer to the last question, that it's not one thing or another, I think. And so no, price obviously is important, and people use many of these commodities because they are cheaper than other commodities. But that I think, as we, particularly in the context of looking at a European, UK, North American due diligence regulation, we also have to look at what the markets are for those commodities. We can't do things by ourselves. We're not going to, no, we could up the price in Europe and pay for the islands of sustainability, but what we actually have to look at is the overall consumption. And many governments around the world have large populations and a lot of poverty, and they are definitely not looking at increasing prices for basic commodities at the moment. And so thinking through, how do we find solutions which look attractive to all of the big users, rather than just looking attractive to those of us who are in the very privileged position of living in countries which are already largely sort of out of extreme poverty. I think that's also really, really important. And that's another of the learnings of the last 20 years, that we can propose solutions and approaches, but we need to talk to everybody who is going to be involved and make sure that they seem like good approaches for everyone. I think price is super important. I mean, absolutely, James is right to raise it, and no, are we externalizing the environmental and social costs is clearly a really important thing. But if we just try and do it unilaterally, I think we will simply develop a two-tier market. What we need to look at is how can we work on that globally.
Thank you. I think now we have a poll question to ask before I come back to the next question, which comes from Antoinette. So hold yourself ready, Antoinette, but let's ask the poll question first, and I will read it out to break up this stream of noise coming from the panelists and myself. So the question is, what strategies are your organization currently using to mitigate risk in your supply chains? It's a multiple choice question, so tick all that apply. A is sourcing requirements for suppliers. B is technology, such as satellite monitoring. C is certification. D is landscape level and jurisdictional collaborations. E is none. So please, if you can answer that question, then we can collate the answers and see from the stakeholder community that's on this call what sorts of things are going on. So please tick as we go through. I will give you a few seconds. Right, while that is ongoing, if it's not too complicated for the team, can we give the microphone to Antoinette to ask her question? Because in a sense, this is a reverse from the previous question. Ah, no. I'm seeing the question on my screen, team. I'm not seeing the results. So if we can. Sorry, I'm getting a message from the team behind the scenes to, I just have to allow you to fill it in because it's taking a bit longer than we thought it would. So please. Okay, now I'm being told that we can leave it on, but move to Antoinette. Yes, so please, we've had a behind the scenes glitch. So if you filled it in, please fill it in again if it allows you to do so. Antoinette, can we pass to you? Silence. Is Antoinette there? Sorry, I've just had another comment from the behind the scenes team, which says, if you are not a company, so this is a message to all of the participants, if you're not a company, please tick what you would vote for that you think should be used. So if you're a representative of a civil society organization or some other institution or a private citizen, please tick whichever strategies you think should be used. Right, do we have Antoinette? No. All right, I will ask Antoinette's Salah's question. If deforestation ends, where would communities in farming and agribusiness get their sustainable livelihoods? How will they be fed? From cheap and unhealthy food imports? Question mark. What local legal assurances are to be in place to avoid a deforestation-free supply chain disadvantaging local communities? Any thoughts on that? Roslyn.
Yes, Tim. Thank you. And that's a very interesting question from Antoinette, and one that we get a lot from the landscapes, because first of all, we have all sort of agreed.
We're losing you again. Can you try turning your camera off?
Alternative?
Sorry, we lost you for all of that. Can you try turning? Thank you, Roslyn. Try again.
Okay, Tim. Can you hear me now?
Yes,
sorry
I can
about
hear
this.
you.
I don't know, I'm having a very bad internet day. Sorry about that. So what I was saying was the question that Antoinette is asking is one that we get a lot when we get into our landscapes, because first of all, we've all agreed that deforestation and forest degradation are sources of livelihoods and for rural communities, farmers, and forest-free communities. And so if we are saying that we are stopping them, then what is the alternative? And I'm sure we've had different presentations about alternative and additional livelihood schemes and making this available for communities and forest dwellers alike. But really, Antoinette, to get into your question, we shouldn't think that deforestation is what is going to supply our livelihoods all the time. Think about the era when there wasn't that much deforestation, but people still survived. Now, in any case, deforestation is still going to happen to some extent because we are going to have to make way, take 1 or 2 trees out. Forest degradation is going to happen to some extent, but the extent to which it happens and the extent to which we plan for it is what is very important. For example, what we have identified in our work in Ghana is that we need a lot of landscape planning to agree on where we are going to put to farm lands. If you put a place to a farmland, that's the zone you have assigned it. That's the land use you have assigned it. But today it's not being cleared. When it's cleared in 10 years, your land use plan already identifies that that place is supposed to be a farm. So if it's cleared in 10 years for farming, it's part of the structure. But because we don't have any significant land use plan, today somebody gets up and clears this area, another gets up and clears it. It's not sustainable, it's not practical, it's not planned. And that's what the issue is, and that's where our issues are coming from. So for example, if we're able to do very good land use planning, and we're able to zone our landscapes and assign different plots for different land uses, then we know that this place is supposed to be for a farm, but it hasn't been farmed today. Doesn't mean it cannot be farmed tomorrow. So when it's farmed tomorrow, then it's part of a sustainable plan of planned deforestation, which has been accounted for. We know the consequences of what is going to happen, and we've already even put in place mitigation strategies for that particular piece of land, eventually when it is going to be farmed.
I think you've come to an end naturally.
Very good land use planning and zoning, and this is going to really help.
Thank you, Rosalind. Does anybody else want to comment on that? Ruqaiya?
Yeah, I want to comment. Again, I want to highlight about the collaboration. So actually, this is based on our experience in the ground. Actually, you know, as I mentioned in the first, that mostly of independent smallholder, they come from the rubber farmer. So and also part of them also there is a paddy farmer. And so why they are changed to the palm oil? Because because in their village area, all of the meal is already palm oil. So why they change to the palm oil? So this is the theory is if there is a demand, so you have to supply, right? And there is also palm oil is already there, and also we still have another commodities like maybe vegetable or paddy. So can we open the collaboration with the mill to support the local farmer, not only support the independent smallholder or not only support for the palm oil farmer, but also the local farmer to produce chili or a paddy or chicken or everything. So they are not thinking to change their commodities to the palm oil. So you can imagine that in the palm oil mill or in the company, they not only need FFB to produce, but they also have the people to eat, right? So can we collaborate with them so they can buy the food from the local mill? So this is also the strategy how we can support the indigenous people or local communities to continue their producing in their local food, but and not go to the forest. So this is also the strategy, and we have this experience in Jambi province. So this is also the strategy to stop the smallholder to go to the forest and then planted palm oil, because there is also comment that the palm oil is dangerous. Yes, I say that the palm oil is dangerous in the future if there is no limitation for palm oil expansion. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you very much. Does anybody else want to comment on that question? No. Okay, so I think we got the poll results from last time. We have A and C marginally ahead of B and D. So it's a bit of an aspirational question. Relatively few people want, or their institutions are doing nothing, and relatively equal spread for all of the above. So lots of support amongst the 50-odd people who answered the question that something should be done, and no silver bullet, as has been said by a couple of participants. Okay, Klaus, thanks very much. You can hide that window now. Okay, moving back to the questions, and we'll have another poll question in a minute or two. I would like to go to Maglori. Sorry, my screen is very small today. Maglori 10A. do you want to ask your question in French, or shall I read it out in its English translation? Okay, I don't have any indication on screen that this person is going to ask it, so I will ask it, read it out. Since yesterday, the involvement of grassroots communities in the process of change has become a necessity. That was one of the highlights of yesterday, of course. Access to land and land rights remain guarantees for the involvement of these communities and their lasting commitment to the protection of the environment and forests. How can an agribusiness model be developed whilst ensuring control over land to communities? In due diligence, countries consuming deforestation products, commodities, should they not include land rights in their examination of the supply chain? And in a sense, that segues quite neatly from what Rosalind was saying a minute ago about having a kind of zoning approach to what the land should be for, but this is the legal underpinning for smallholder farmers. So I can see Ruth nodding. Do you want to kick that off?
Sure, and I mean, I think a really important point, and it links, of course, to the question that Michael asked at the beginning and several others. I think this recognition that getting better at recognizing land rights is really important, and I think companies are also increasingly recognizing that. So, for example, we talked, Stephen and myself, about the CGF. Proforest supports the Consumer Goods Forum in developing the roadmaps, and we've now agreed formally internally that the roadmaps that Forest Positive needs to address land rights and grievances around land rights. That's a really important part of thinking about what Forest Positive means. So I think there is that recognition, and part of the reason I think companies are increasingly willing and indeed keen to engage with that is because of this growing recognition that we need to do things collaboratively, because land rights is not something that the private sector should be sorting out by itself. It's all kinds of issues around governance and all of the things that Ruqayyah and Rosalind have been talking about needing government, needing local communities to be empowered. So look, I think companies and supply chains absolutely have to think about that. And what we really need to be working out, I mean, specifically in relation to the due diligence regulation, is how can we do that well? And well, I think one of the things that means is recognizing two things. First, that it's very variable. What works in Indonesia doesn't necessarily work in Ghana, and Brazil is completely different from either of them. And secondly, just this thing that I guess many of us are very familiar with, and has already been raised, but also that communities are not monolithic. They are very heterogeneous as well. And so it's not possible to expect that everywhere everyone will agree with everything, because people, even within local communities, have very different priorities. And so working out how we can do things that are sensible and useful and meaningful within a realistic but time frame, realistic both in terms of urgency, but also Rosalind's point that it does take people time to change, particularly in rural communities. I think if we can think through all of those, then land rights has to become very central to this whole discussion.
Thank you. So can I ask David and Stephen to chip in on this? Because, you know, clearly from Stephen's perspective, you're a supply chain, you work with supply chains to deliver retail goods. To ensure land rights are part of the due diligence framework would require, I guess, you putting pressure on governments. And David, you know, how might that process work in reality? So David first, then Stephen.
Yeah, sure. And I think, so if I'm not mistaken, in the proposal that has been discussed in the European Parliament for their due diligence regulation on deforestation, I think land rights are actually part of that. And of course, we will see what, at the end of this year, the European Commission will actually put forward, if that will indeed also include things like indigenous rights and community rights and land rights. It might very well be the case that those are covered by that due diligence regulation. And then I think, to the point that Ruth made, the question then really become about how are companies going to fill in that obligation? How are we going to make sure that they do that in an effective way, that they don't all stumble over each other to do something separately that in the end might not really help those local communities in better having better being able to enjoy their rights. I think this is certainly something that within standard systems, the whole question, for example, on FPIC, it is a very challenging question, and certainly I think a lot of this also relates to how we can engage collectively through kind of local governance setups that might take different shapes and forms depending on where you're focusing on. And so again, I think this is something that will need a lot of focus. What I don't think is particularly useful is the idea that if we create due diligence regulations here in Europe or in the UK, that then these we kind of tell local communities if their rights are violated, you can go to EU courts and start a procedure. I think those processes perhaps are a very long way around of trying to achieve what you actually want to see. And that is something, of course, where I think it's going to be interesting to see how NGOs try to interpret these laws and then try to bring lawsuits, for example. I think there's I think there might be a lot of disappointment also on the side of local communities that these lawsuits might not necessarily bring the type of outcomes that people really want. So that's just something else to consider in the long term as these due diligence regulations get adopted and then eventually implemented and enforced.
Thank you. Stephen, from your perspective.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Just very briefly, just reflecting, I was just thinking about a former job where I worked for a long time on trying to develop and implement systems that delivered traceability from the field to the mill. And obviously I've spent a lot of time working with smallholders, independent smallholders, and trying to develop systems that would be equitable and could deliver some benefit for the smallholder as well. And obviously, land rights came into that. And a lot of the time working we kind of engaged through the mill and through organizations such as Fortasby to get to the smallholders. But I think, trying to implement it through the supply chain is extremely challenging, even when you have a big buyer who's directly buying from a mill and the mill is on board. The lack of engagement, as Uki was saying, between the mill and the smallholder and the smallholder's needs in terms of land rights recognition and everything else in terms of their livelihoods, it is a very difficult objective to achieve. I think you do need approaches from our perspective, from Tesco's perspective, like the Forest Positive Coalition, because we need to align the supply chain in support of those governments, those districts, those actors in the landscape who are really trying to make meaningful progress on land rights. And that's the only way it can come together. You need all those actors. You can't say it rests with the legal department. You can't say it rests with the tier 1, tier 2, or tier 3. It has to be everybody working in consort. And I think that's the landscape projects which are currently happening with consumer goods companies in Indonesia and Brazil and Central Africa, I think are kind of pioneering the way forwards and this new kind of collaborative model.
Thank you, Stephen. Roslyn, from the government perspective, Rakaya, from the smallholder perspective, any comments on land rights? No, I'll take that as no. All right, can we then move on to our second poll and flash that up? So we've had a bit of practice and hopefully this one will work a bit more smoothly. So I'm going to read the question. What mitigation measures could regulations require for smallholders to drive sustainability progress without unintended negative livelihood consequences? Please tick all that apply. A, national certification schemes. B, national producer country certification schemes. Sorry, A, international certification schemes. B, national certification schemes. C, landscape jurisdictional collaborations. D, requirements for off-taking companies and supply chain actors to support SH programs. E, technology such as satellite monitoring. F, stepwise improvement programs / roadmaps for smallholder supply. G, other. So again, please tick all that apply. And we'll just leave that up there for a little while. Okay, while people are looking at that, I will move on to the next question, and to avoid too much toing and froing with microphones, I will ask the question because it's a short one to David from Bin Tran. I wonder whether ISEAL looks how due diligence processes do not exclude small and informal businesses. David, do you want to tackle that one?
Yeah, sure. I can give some thought to that, and I think it's a really good question because it's very topical in terms of a range of organizations trying to figure this out as well, because we know that due diligence regulations, if they're implemented in a narrow form, they might very well lead to the exclusion of informal smallholders or high-risk producers, which are often smallholders. And of course, the thing is that in the voluntary space and working with standard and certification systems, we've known this challenge for a very long time, that if you develop a standard system and you want quite ambitious high-level criteria, then you risk making quite difficult for smallholders to comply with those standards. You need to give them a system of support to really work towards those standards. And so standard systems have often and also thought about how can we develop smallholder standards that are specifically adapted to solve these issues. Various of our members have found different solutions to that, but it has remained, quite a challenging field that requires constant thinking and adaptation. Now, if you then transpose this challenge to a legal framework, I think a lot of things have to be again considered. And from our side, we certainly think there needs to be enough flexibility in that legal framework to cater to all those challenges and to give the space to companies and producers to work towards, to work those out. Now, there's been some concrete discussions, for example, if these due diligence regulations should have some kind of carve out for smallholders in supply chains, that they have, 5 more years to comply with what is actually in the due diligence regulations. I don't know if that is necessarily the solution, just to kind of give them some type of grace period. I think it might be helpful, but perhaps there's other solutions that are more effective there. And again, I think a lot can be learned from the experience with standard systems, but also a lot of other programs that have focused on smallholder capacity building, some of which we've heard here about today. I think one of the things that really will need to be unpacked is how you set all these options apart and then try to integrate that within a law, or at least the secondary law that will start looking at the details. So I don't have the full answer to this question, of course, but it's certainly a very good one that will need further attention.
Thank you, David. Right, let's look at the poll results. Klaus, if you could. Okay, so looking down the list, the one that gets the most support is stepwise improvement programs for smallholder supply. And then the next on the list is landscape / jurisdictional collaborations. So again, I think, in my mind, this raises the spectre for how long will it take us collectively to deal with this issue. And from a climate risk perspective or a biodiversity perspective, how much time will we have relative to the growing risks that we will end up in quite tricky situations because of it. So very interesting results there. The final point I would make is that technology is not the silver bullet, according to our participants, which I think many of us would have guessed. Anyway, right, we've only got a little while left before we move to the wrap up. So let's just try some quick fire questions, and to avoid too much toing and froing with the microphone, I will tick them off quickly. First one to Ruqaiya. What is the impact of landscape scale approaches to sustainable palm oil in Indonesia? Do these help support smallholder farmers?
Oh, sorry, I'm still mute. Okay. Yes, actually, the jurisdictional approach or landscape approach, this will help smallholders to completely comply with the standard, because in the landscape level, everyone had to work together and sharing responsibility. So this is also our approach in the future. So how we can, for example, our member also can work in their landscape to spreading the sustainability norm to other communities, because actually the sustainability there is no impact for the smallholder if they only work in the sustainability only work in their plot, but the sustainability will impact to the all if the smallholder also spreading the norm to other, not only in for smallholder but also for the local community, for the village level, and maybe in the bigger landscape is for in the district level. Yes.
Thank you, Ruqaiya. The next question upvoted on the list, it comes from Tiago Kanashiro at Chatham House, and thank you to Terry Slaven for their last question. And Tiago's question is, what are the benefits and drawbacks or risks of supporting smallholder farmers whose rural livelihoods are currently based on self-sufficiency to transition into farming entrepreneurship for export markets? So what are the benefits and costs or risks of that transition from self-sufficiencies and self-supply to farming for export markets? Who would like to tackle that question? Anybody want to?
Hi, Tim.
Ah, Rosalind, yeah, hello. Sorry,
Yes.
because you're not on camera, I couldn't see you on the
I
screen.
hope
Yeah.
my internet doesn't give me any problem this time around. Yes.
Thank you.
But really, that is really the way to go, if you ask me, because that's really the bedrock of sustainability and the whole essence of this local ownership that we talk about. Because, you know, what we have realized, for example, in Ghana, is cocoa farming is part of our culture. So it's become more like a family inheritance. And realize that most of the farmers haven't transitioned into the business aspect of cocoa farming. This is an industry, it's a sector that is generating billions of dollars, but we keep referring to the farmers as poor. And there's a disconnect in there. How come they are at the very base of this production, of this industry that is billions of dollars, but then they are being referred to as poor because they haven't transitioned into the business aspect of cocoa farming or cocoa production. If we are able to get them to see the business aspect, then they are getting into that self-sufficiency. They are removing the elements of middlemen and people who are engaging with them, the lack of transparency, issues with weighing, with their scales. I mean, that's really where we are getting to. So for the programs we are having in Ghana, we are building the capacity of farmers. We are giving them farmer business school training, we're enhancing their capacity in bookkeeping, their records, how they're able to value the whole value chain from farm to the production process, because they have been left out of this, and they haven't been left out deliberately. It is because it hasn't been part of their heritage or their inheritance of getting these farms as just a family inheritance. It's just passed on from generation to generation. But when they see the business models, then they're also building their capacity to even learn how to save the money. How do they save? How do they use their income for other things? How do they diversify their income sources? How do they incorporate other interventions into their farming practices? That also diversifies their income. So really, if we're able to do this, then we are on a very good path to sustainable practices, because right from the farmer to the consumer, the production chain is a business entity that is expected to run, that is expected to give some return on investment, and that is expected to always feed back. So it becomes a loop, and it's a sustainable loop and a sustainable cycle. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosalind. We're just about out of time, but I would like to squeeze in the last question that we've got time for from Feja Lesniewska, and it's about how can we develop a cross-sectoral approach between agricultural commodities and mineral commodities, especially in the race to move to zero carbon economic systems. So we've largely been talking about agricultural commodities, but of course, land provides many different forms of services, including tourism, biodiversity services, related services, mineral commodities, and so on. And how can we get to that fostering across sectors and not just within sectors? So if anybody's got a 30-second answer of a bright idea, I can see David nodding. No, he doesn't have 30 seconds of bright idea. David, do you want to say something? Put you on the spot.
Yeah, no, I think this is, it's a very good point. And I think my reflection was that, again, from the perspective of due diligence regulations, those would focus companies to really look really narrowly at their supply chains. And so this type of cross-sectoral collaboration, that in itself would not be supported by a due diligence framework, I believe. Again, to the point that we need something more than that. We need a whole set of interlocking policies to tackle global deforestation. And there, this type of cross-sectoral focus really, should come into play, I think. I do think it also goes back to this question of how do we develop the concepts of landscape and jurisdictional approaches, which would be cross-sectoral, cross-commodity as well. But in practice, we do see that most of these are very much focused on ag still. But there's nothing that would prevent other economic activities to be also integrated in that type of setups. So I'll keep it at that.
Thank you very much. I think we better call a halt to the question and answer session, and I'll hand over to Ruth now for a 5 or 6 minute summing up for, if you can manage that, of a very rich discussion and very rich panel presentations. Ruth, over to you.
Thanks, Tim, and thanks to everyone. I think it was indeed really a great discussion, and these things aren't always, especially online, but I found it really helpful. And some of the questions I think we will take away, certainly at ProForest, and think about them more, because I think there's been some really very useful things raised. And I think for me, what comes out really strongly is that there is very strong alignment across all of the people speaking, but also many of the questions, and very clearly in the polls, that there is absolutely a need for this working beyond supply chains as well as in them, for local engagement, local empowerment, and leadership and collaboration. And so we need to think about how do we actually integrate that into the development of the due diligence regulation and the surrounding policies, as David's been saying. There are lots of examples already of good practice, and there are also lots of examples of what happens if we don't think about this. And I was really struck by Rikaya's kind of bringing alive that sense of the small independent smallholders in Indonesia, who are suddenly faced with these requirements, which seem really sensible to us sitting comfortably in wherever we are. But if you're there in the middle of your smallholder plot somewhere in Sumatra or Kalimantan, suddenly being told that there are all of these requirements that you don't understand, don't know how to implement, is incredibly worrying and disempowering. And how do we think about achieving our aims without that kind of exclusion of the many millions of people who are needing to make a living. And I was also really struck by Rosalind's point that she made once or twice in different ways, that there are huge advantages for governments in collaborating. And I work a lot with companies, and companies are realizing that there are huge advantages in collaborating, but governments, I think the same. NGOs and civil society have a long tradition of collaborating. And so I think we are at a point where there is a real recognition that collaboration and working together is fundamental. It's not a luxury add-on. It's actually got to be the basis of how we move forward. And no, some of the other points, the question David answered about, no, what do we do about the informal sector? These things are messy, and we are not going to come up with a kind of perfect approach. And we have to make sure that in trying to close loopholes, we don't at the same time end up having perverse impacts that we don't want to have. And so I think what it means is that we really need to build on all of that learning and all of that complexity, and not just focus on this from a single perspective or a single vision. And that, I think, is a really big challenge. We are in a time when people tend to be quite polarized, when people are very, very strong about what they think right looks like, and not always good at listening to what right looks like for other people. And so I think that's also going to be really important as the UK or the European Union or the US, if they also develop a due diligence mechanism. How do we make sure that we come up with something which is powerful and effective, but looks like it's right for the producers around the world, for the governments around the world, in the places where things are produced? And the other thing that's come up several times is speed. You've referred to it too, Tim. One of the things I think we need to learn is, I think for the last 20 years, I've heard people saying, but we don't have time to go through a process, it's too urgent. And I think we lost many years because we didn't recognize that, like it or not, you can't force change on people. You have to go through the process. So let's start now. Yes, it would have been better 10 years ago, but now is better than never. So let's be ambitious, but also realistic about the time it will take to change. But let's get people into that process, not exclude them. So no, finally, I think what we are really, and I feel like there is quite strong alignment on this, is that it's absolutely crucial that the due diligence regulations don't de-incentivize the private sector from engaging and investing and supporting change in high-risk origins, in the places where deforestation is happening. And incidentally, I mean, it needs to be linked also to social issues, and human rights due diligence should be doing exactly the same, pushing to engage. So, and I think what that means is that we will need the right balance of realism, pragmatism, I guess we've been talking about that, and building on that practical experience, but also making sure that there's a sufficient assurance and credibility to make it actually drive progress. So back over to you. Thanks to everyone.
No, thank you for that fantastic summing up. So just a few thanks from me. Obviously, thanks to Ruth, Rosalind, Stephen, David, and Ruqaiya for brilliant presentations. Thanks, everybody. We've had 150 or so people on the call for joining and putting in your questions. Sorry for the questions that we didn't have time to tackle. Really, thank you for the behind-the-scenes crowd having to deal with complex technical issues as we go along in this new hybrid world. And just, you know, I think it's been a really brilliant session. And final point from me is that we're going to end the session now, 30-minute break, and then the next session coming back will be what space for forests and forest-dependent peoples in future land use scenarios. So big thanks to everybody, and go and enjoy a break. And from me, a very personal thanks to the speakers and everybody behind the scenes. Au revoir, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.